A subcontractor having steak? Make sure you cover my bill too.
This is Greg Smith, a manager from our client company, whom I ran into at a high-end restaurant. He always looks down on me, a subcontractor, and acts arrogantly. But tonight, he's been particularly persistent, probably because he's been drinking. He put his hand on my shoulder, got uncomfortably close with his booze breath, and laughed obnoxiously. Sure thing. I managed to slip out from under Greg's arm and replied that to him. In return, we'll cancel the upcoming contract.
What?
Greg froze, not understanding what I said.
The upcoming contract is worth $13 million. Are you seriously going to turn down a $13 million deal?
As Greg, then pale, continued to harass me, a gentleman with a kind smile stepped in.
You're.
At that moment, the arrogant king realized his downfall was imminent. My name is Keith Monroe, 41 years old. I am the president of Monroe Manufacturing, a company I inherited from my father. Monroe Manufacturing makes electrical equipment parts and has been in business for about 40 years. We have around 20 employees. All of them are skilled craftsmen who have been with us since my father's time. Compared to them, I'm still a rookie, learning the ropes. After graduating college, I worked for a major electronics manufacturer to gain experience. I returned 5 years ago to take over the business. My father had been in poor health, and just as I was settling in, he was hospitalized. Since starting the company, my father worked from morning till night. After handing it over to me, he must have felt relieved because he passed away shortly after. Even though I took over, I was still clueless about many things. On top of that, losing my father left me feeling completely lost. But it was the employees who encouraged and supported me through it all. They watched over my growth and supported the company like a second father. For the past 5 years, I've been working tirelessly to fulfill my duties as president. When my father was around, our clients were friendly. But as soon as they dealt with a young president, they started to try taking advantage of us. Dealing with such clients was challenging, but whenever that happened, Ken Thompson, the company's most senior employee and my father's right-hand man, would back me up and give a stern look. I'm relatively small and often come across as timid. My wife often says she married me because I seemed kind and unlikely to cheat. Ken, on the other hand, is 65, but he's tall, has a sharp face and piercing eyes, and speaks in a calm but commanding manner, which intimidates others. Thanks to him, even when clients tried to unfairly cut prices, a single glare from Ken made them tremble and offer a fair price. However, I can't rely on Ken forever, so over the past year or two, I've been making efforts to handle negotiations on my own. As a result, recently, clients have started to respect me more. But there was one person who continued to underestimate and belittle me.
Hey, Keith. I went out of my way to come here, and you can't even offer me a cup of tea? Typical subcontractor behavior.
He was lounging arrogantly in the reception room chair and spoke loudly. He is Greg Smith, the sales manager of the main contractor, wrapped in a high-end suit and wearing silver-rimmed glasses. His appearance exudes an unpleasant arrogance. Greg started dealing with my father when he was just a young salesman, and the products using our parts sold for high prices overseas, boosting his standing in the company. Nearly 30 years later, he climbed the ranks to become a manager. When my father was alive, he was always friendly, saying things like, "I owe who I am today to you, Mr. Monroe." But as soon as I took over, his attitude changed completely, and he began to look down on me. Still, whenever Ken was around, Greg showed some restraint. But when I was alone, He always acted condescendingly. "We keep you in business, kid. Don't forget that." He'd mockingly call me kid and belittle me.
Subcontractors should show more respect to the main contractors. Got it?
As I brought the tea and sat back down in front of Greg, he glared at me and sneered. "Yes, I'm sorry." Knowing it wouldn't help to argue, I smiled vaguely and answered,
Do you realize how special it is that I'm here? A manager like me usually doesn't visit subcontractors.
"Yes, I appreciate you coming all the way here," I answered seriously. But it was true that recently, a mid-level salesperson had been handling our account. So Greg coming here was unusual. "So what brings you here today?" When I asked, Greg, as if waiting for this moment, began to speak eagerly.
I've got something good for you today. A new order.
His sly smile was unsettling, but I decided to hear him out about this new order. "Thank you very much. What does this new order entail?"
Here it is.
He pulled out some documents from his bag as he said that. I flipped through them, and they appeared to be design plans for parts that we could handle. Yes, this seems doable. By the way, what about the deadline and the amount? As I started to ask, Greg interrupted loudly.
Great. You said it's doable. So, the deal is sealed.
He then waved the contract in front of me, saying, "Sign this." I was shocked when I looked at it. The deadline was in 3 days, and the amount was half of our usual rate. "Mr. Smith, this is a bit. The amount aside, we can't meet the deadline in 3 days." When I said that, Greg's face turned stern.
What? You just said it was doable. Are you lying to the main contractor?
"No," I said it seemed doable, but I didn't agree to it. Feeling exasperated, I gently denied it. But Greg glared at me, breathing heavily.
Don't get cocky. I could shut down this tiny company with just a word.
He threatened me in a low voice. Just then, Ken walked in, saying, "Excuse me." The moment Greg saw Ken, his face immediately changed to a pleasant smile.
Oh, Ken, didn't realize you were here.
Ken shot a sharp look at Greg while picking up the documents in front of me.
Delivery in 3 days and this amount.
Ken muttered quietly, and Greg looked embarrassed. Ken looked between Greg and me, then nodded at me.
Keith, if I may, let's take this job.
"What?" "But that would be a really tight schedule."
Since it's a request from Greg, let's do our best.
Hearing Ken's words, Greg jumped up.
As expected, Ken, you're quick to decide. Unlike someone else.
Ken shot a sharp look at Greg. Greg immediately shrank back.
Anyway, it's urgent, please.
He urged me to sign the contract as he said that. Since Ken suggested it, I reluctantly signed, feeling somewhat relieved. Given Greg's earlier outburst, I would have ended up signing anyway, but thanks to Ken framing it as a favor to Greg, it felt like we had the upper hand. Greg thanked Ken, who remained expressionless, and left. Ken and I were alone. "Thank you, Ken."
No problem. Sorry for accepting so readily. Let's get everyone working on this right away.
Ken flashed me a grin and headed toward the factory. I sighed, then steeled myself and followed him to the factory.
Hey, thanks for your help the other day. You got it done just in time.
A week after the delivery, I got a call from a very pleased Greg. "No, it's only natural to fulfill our obligations once we take on a job," I answered modestly, and Greg laughed loudly. "Well, now I know your company won't complain about that price. From now on, we'll use that amount as the standard." I was shocked and quickly replied, "Wait a minute, Greg. That was a one-time emergency, right? It doesn't apply to our regular contracts."
What? Who said anything about an emergency?
"You did." As I pushed back against his feigned ignorance, Greg suddenly raised his voice.
Oh, do you have any proof that I said that? Come on, show me the proof. Hurry up. You don't have any, do you? So don't talk nonsense.
Greg sneered as I was left speechless. But I knew the truth about that previous order. The current account manager had sympathetically told me during the delivery,
I'm really sorry. Thank you so much. The manager completely forgot he had accepted this order. When the factory followed up close to the deadline, it came to light. Apparently, he intended to send it overseas at first and quoted a low price.
shaking his head in disbelief. He continued,
Of course, it's too late to send it overseas now. But when they needed someone who could make precise parts on such short notice, they thought of you, Keith. He was confident you'd take it on because of your long-standing relationship.
Greg had made us cover for his mistake. And now, following the proverb, out of sight, out of mind, he shamelessly tried to cut future costs as well.
Anyway, I'll expect that price for future contracts too. Well, you don't really have the right to refuse, do you?
With that, he abruptly hung up the phone. I stared at the receiver in shock. If we took on jobs at that price, our company would go under. I must have looked quite pale that day. Ken approached me with concern in his eyes.
Keith, are you feeling unwell?
Ken placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder, and I told him about the call with Greg.
So that's what happened. I'm sorry. It's my fault for saying we should take on the job.
Seeing Ken's face turn pale, I shook my head. No, whether we took it or not, the outcome would have been the same. If we had refused, he would have said no to future contracts. I laughed weakly, and suddenly Ken grabbed my shoulders firmly.
Keith, I have an idea. Would you trust me to handle this?
His intense gaze left me no choice but to nod vigorously. What's your plan, Ken?
Well, it's...
Ken began to speak with a confident smile. As I listened, I nodded deeply in agreement. About 10 days later, I found myself in a high-end restaurant. It was my first time there, but it was the town's most prestigious restaurant, with an impressive ambience and excellent food and drinks. The conversation with my dinner companion was going well, and in high spirits, I excused myself to use the restroom.
On my way back, I heard a voice I didn't want to hear in a place like this.
I turned around, feeling uneasy, and sure enough, there was Greg. He looked quite drunk, his face flushed. When I gave a silent nod and tried to leave, he grabbed my arm firmly.
Hey, subcontractor. Ignoring me, the manager of the main contractor. You've gotten pretty full of yourself, haven't you?
He was unsteady on his feet, but his grip on my arm was surprisingly strong. If I tried to shake him off, he'd probably fall, so I had no choice but to face him. Greg, I'm here on personal business today. I said that politely to him, but his face twisted.
Oh, personal business. What, you making enough money to afford a high-end steak dinner? Or are you mooching off someone? Yeah, that's it. No way a guy like you could afford this steak otherwise.
He pointed at me while laughing and throwing out insults. He was clearly a mean drunk. I tried to think of a way to leave peacefully, but my efforts were shattered by his next words.
Ah, your father must be rolling in his grave with someone like you as his successor. But I guess it's fitting for the son of a man who could only manage a subcontracting business. Pathetic, both of you.
I was struggling to contain my rising anger. Insulting me was one thing, but why drag my father into it?
A subcontractor having stake? Cover my bill too.
Greg kept pestering, putting his hand on my shoulder, his breath reeking of alcohol as he leaned in, laughing obnoxiously. Fine. I managed to slip out from under Greg's arm and replied. Greg smirked and sneered.
Oh, you think you can cover the bill at a place like this? Look, it's $1,500. Yeah, $1,500. Go on, pay up.
I clenched my fists even tighter in humiliation. In that case, I'll pay the bill, but let's cancel the upcoming contract.
What?
Greg stopped in his tracks, looking dumbfounded.
The upcoming contract is worth $13 million. Are you seriously going to turn down a $13 million deal?
Finally grasping what I said, Greg shouted that in a panic.
That's right.
A clear voice sounded from behind Greg.
What? Mind your own business.
Greg turned around, glaring suspiciously at the person.
You.
His face, which had been bright red, began to turn pale.
I'm sure you are Greg Smith. It's been a while.
The man smiling warmly was Anthony Jones, a director at the largest trading company in the industry.
We met at a client's party the other day. Oh, Keith, you've been gone for quite a while after going to the restroom, so I came to check if you were feeling unwell.
Anthony said this kindly and smiled at me. Sorry for worrying you. I got held up by this gentleman as I showed my discomfort. Still held by Greg's arm, Anthony feigned surprise.
Oh, do you two know each other? This seems like quite a tense situation.
Under his gaze, Greg hurriedly let go of my arm.
Mr. Jones, what kind of relationship do you have with Mr. Monroe?
Greg asked Anthony nervously, his voice shaky. It was no wonder he was intimidated by Anthony. Anthony is a director at the largest company in the industry, much bigger than Greg's company. To him, Greg's company is just another among many. Seeing someone so high up in the hierarchy talking to a subcontractor like me left Greg shocked. Moreover, Anthony was very polite to me. Greg, trying to understand our relationship, looked at us with probing eyes. And then Anthony calmly said,
Normally, I wouldn't discuss business matters with someone outside our company, but we're planning to work with Keith's company, so I invited him to dinner to get acquainted.
What?
Greg was too shocked to form words.
Why? Why would a director like you entertain such a small manufacturing company? He's my subcontractor.
Finally finding his voice, Greg spouted nonsense. Greg, I must remind you that our company does not work exclusively for you. I replied Greg while feeling exasperated, and he glared at me.
Don't get cocky.
He growled. And as I mentioned earlier, we've decided not to do business with your company anymore.
What?
Greg's mouth fell open in shock. He stood there speechless.
What do you think you're doing? You think a subcontractor can make decisions like that?
He lunged at me, trying to strangle me. Stop that. Ken's sharp voice cut through the tension. Greg turned around, startled. There stood Ken, with a stern look on his face.
Even you, Ken.
It seemed Greg was intimidated by Ken, who had known him since he was just a new salesman. Greg never dared to insult or threaten me when Ken was around. It should probably be the other way around since I'm the president and Ken is the employee. I had known Ken since I was a child, and even then, he had an imposing presence that made me think, I mustn't make this man angry. So I could understand why Greg was so intimidated by Ken.
Greg, as our president said, we won't be doing business with you anymore.
Ken's tone was calm, but his gaze was sharp as he glared at Greg.
But Ken, we've known each other for so long.
Greg pleaded in a pathetic voice.
It's you who have disrespected our long-standing relationship, Greg.
Ken, tall and imposing, looked down at the smaller Greg with his arms crossed. Just moments ago, Greg's face was flushed from the alcohol, but now it was pale.
You mentioned a $13 million deal, but it should have been estimated at $20 million. Why did you lower the amount? What else could this be but a sign of disrespect?
Ken sharply questioned him, and Greg shook his head vigorously.
No, it wasn't disrespect. I just wanted to teach this inexperienced president a lesson about the harsh realities of business.
Our president is not inexperienced, and who are you to teach anyone about the harsh realities of business?
Yikes.
Ken's voice rose slightly, and Greg flinched. I can't help but wonder, is there something between you and Greg? This doesn't seem like a typical relationship between a contractor and an employee. Curiosity got the best of me, and I asked Ken.
Eh?
Huh?
Both of them looked at me simultaneously, making me regret asking.
Haha, Kenny, you should tell Keith about it. It does seem rather strange for anyone who doesn't know.
Anthony laughed as he said that. He seemed to be thoroughly enjoying the situation.
Kenny?
Greg was astonished at the familiarity Anthony showed.
Ah, it's nothing significant.
Ken sighed and began to speak.
It was back when your father had just started the company. I used to be a delinquent, always getting into fights and thinking I'd never get a decent job. Then my mother got sick, and I needed money for her hospital bills. I didn't want to resort to crime, so I desperately looked for work. That's when I met your father.
He spoke with a nostalgic look.
Your father took me in, and I worked hard. Then Greg here showed up as a salesperson. To my surprise, he was someone I had once helped in a street fight during my delinquent days.
Greg turned his face away, looking embarrassed at Ken's words.
He was a rich kid who had angered some thugs and tried to pay them off. They beat him up pretty badly. Even thugs have their pride, you know. I didn't think it was right to gang up on one person, so I intervened. I fought off the thugs and took him to the hospital, then brought him home.
Now I understood the aura of intimidation that Ken had.
When we met again and saw each other's faces, it hit us. He begged me to help him secure a contract and get a meeting with your father. I introduced him to your father, and that's how the deal was made. Thanks to that, he got to where he is today, so maybe he still feels indebted to me.
I understood his explanation and nodded to myself. That's why Greg acted so submissively towards Ken.
He probably couldn't stand being deferential to your father and me, as he's naturally arrogant. As a result, he treated you poorly, thinking he could push you around once you took over. He assumed you'd be more pliable, leading to this situation.
Ken then glared at Greg, who was looking away, and said clearly,
Don't talk about the harsh realities of society. A small-minded person like you has no right to speak like that. Our president is far more capable than you could ever be.
Greg had a frown on his face in frustration, but at Ken's final yell, he cried out, "Eek!" and jumped up. He was clearly still afraid of Ken.
Well, I mean, you don't have to bring up things from decades ago.
He mumbled that quietly.
Now, Keith, are you satisfied?
Anthony cheerfully followed up on Ken's explanation.
But how did you and Anthony end up connected, Ken? And why did he call you Kenny earlier?
Greg blurted out his confusion to Ken.
Oh, that. Kenny and I are childhood friends. We lost touch in middle school, but got reconnected a few years ago. We've been meeting occasionally since then.
Anthony answered Greg's question nonchalantly.
Childhood friends.
Greg repeated the words weakly.
Anthony went to a prestigious private school for middle school and then to Harvard. I thought we lived in different worlds, but when we talked, I realized he hadn't changed at all. Unlike someone here, he never bragged about being an elite.
Ken's sarcastic remark hit home, and Greg looked down.
So, you got the contract just because you knew each other from childhood?
Still not giving up, Greg muttered complaints.
At our age, it doesn't matter what college you went to. What matters is how you've lived your life. Isn't that right?
Anthony glared at Greg as he said that.
Kenny is a top-notch engineer now. I wouldn't give him a contract just because he's a friend. And you still don't understand the true value of Monroe Manufacturing, do you?
The true value?
Exactly. After all these years, you still don't know the kind of work they do?
Mr. Jones shook his head, truly exasperated.
From what I've heard, Keith is a highly skilled engineer. Since he took over the company, he has obtained several patents. The company may not be large, but it has skilled craftsmen and the flexibility to meet various demands. I'm planning to have them supply parts for our products in an upcoming deal worth about $50 million.
Greg gasped at Anthony's words. If our negotiations with Anthony's company go well, it could lead to more significant deals in the future. Not only that, but being recognized by Anthony Jones would skyrocket our company's reputation. On the other hand, Greg would be seen as the manager who got cut off by Monroe Manufacturing. Moreover, Greg had treated us poorly for so long. Finding another company willing to put up with his unreasonable demands will be nearly impossible. All these thoughts must have been swirling in Greg's head. He was frozen, pale, with a cold sweat running down his cheek.
Keith?
Greg gulped and edged closer to me. A creepy smile was plastered on his face. Yes, what is it? I replied reluctantly, and suddenly Greg clung to my legs.
I deeply apologize for all my past rudeness. Please, I beg for your forgiveness.
He clung to my legs tightly, refusing to let go. Please stop. You might not realize, but this is a high-end restaurant. If we cause a scene, they'll throw us out. I was bewildered, but Greg clung to me even tighter.
No, I won't let go until you forgive me and promise me not to cancel the contract. What will it be?
Greg, with his hair disheveled, looked terrifying. I was so shocked that I almost agreed to forgive him.
All right, that's enough.
Anthony clapped his hands and said that firmly.
Greg, let's stop this cheap act. By the way, you might not know this, but I am quite close with your company's president, and I've recorded this entire conversation. I wonder what your president will say when he hears it.
No way.
Anthony was cheerful as he said that, and Greg's body went limp. Taking advantage of the moment, I stepped away from Greg.
Greg, in today's world, it's unacceptable for a main contractor to look down on a subcontractor. It's thanks to the hard work of subcontractors that we can create our products. I want to keep the U.S. at the forefront of technology with these talented people.
Anthony's calm words made Greg slump.
Are you saying I was wrong? Me?
He clutched his head, groaning, and collapsed to the floor.
Well, let's go. Kenny and I have a favorite bar. Shall we continue the evening there?
Anthony smiled at Ken and me.
Sounds good. Let's go then.
Yes, please take us there. I smiled back at Ken and Anthony. After our contract was terminated, Greg tried to offload the $13 million job elsewhere, but no one would accept it due to the tight deadline and low price. As time ticked away, Greg contacted his client in a panic, just days before the deadline, leading to a furious response. In the ensuing chaos, the matter escalated to a lawsuit. Moreover, rumors spread within Greg's company that losing our contract was his fault. Meanwhile, our company gained significant recognition from our deal with Anthony's firm, further tarnishing Greg's reputation. Ultimately, Greg was deemed heavily responsible and was reassigned to a remote location, demoted to a regular employee. Unable to bear the humiliation, Greg resigned. His equally prideful wife left him, taking their children and demanding an exorbitant amount in alimony and child support, which he managed to pay. Although he managed to pay, Greg lost his job and money and started drinking and causing trouble every night. Eventually, he angered the wrong people and was taken away, never to be heard from again. One of his former subordinates told me that Greg was probably working in some factory. After Greg disappeared, this subordinate apologized to me and asked if we could renew our contract. The terms were fair, so I agreed. Since then, we've continued to work diligently. Our deal with Anthony's company was a great success, leading to continuous work and numerous new business opportunities. This increased our workload significantly, so we plan to expand our factory and hire many more employees. However, we intend to carefully select new hires, with input from Ken and other veteran staff. Speaking of Ken, I've been joining him and Anthony for drinks more often lately. Ken's stern demeanor hasn't changed, but he always looks happy talking to Anthony, reminding me that friendships remain precious at any age. Anthony surprised me by knowing my father. When he was still a rookie, my father was an engineer for one of their clients.
Your father, Keith, was truly exceptional. He had a strong sense of self and integrity. As a newbie, I admired him and wanted to become like him.
His nostalgic words struck a chord with me as I listened over a drink. Ken nodded in agreement.
Your father was strict but kind. You have inherited his kindness. Have more confidence in yourself. You have the talent, and I can vouch for that.
I was grateful for their wisdom. Will I ever be like these men? Like my father? I have some doubts, but I'll keep working hard to meet everyone's expectations. I want to continue growing, supported by my family, employees, and clients.